It's so interesting. I think that first of all, I like a lot about the work, almost everything. I like the grassroots nature of it. I like working with the local partners. I liked at the time I
I
was there,
can
Church World Service
see
was
you.
really on the cutting edge of a lot
I
of different
can
things.
see me. I'll be the eyes so that I just can be.
This is another episode of a special series called Enough for All of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. This series sheds light on 75 years of an NGO called CWS. My name is Maurice Bloem and I welcome you to another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Good day, everybody. This is another episode of our podcast about Church World Service, and I'm really thrilled today because we have a really special guest, and that's the CEO of Church World Service, who's actually worked for us before as well. So I would like to ask Rick to introduce himself and tell a little bit about, you know, who he is and his experiences. Rick, can
Yeah.
you please go ahead?
Yeah. Good morning, Maurice. Thank you for having me on your podcast. Very excited to have some time to talk with you about Church World Service and my experiences there. My name is Rick Santos. As you said, I'm the new CEO of Church World Service. I've been working in the field of international relief and development for over 25 years. My time first started, my first overseas experience started in 1987 when I was a volunteer teacher I was a volunteer in mission with the Presbyterian Church USA, and I was teaching at a place called Bangkok Christian College in Bangkok, Thailand.
And Rick, was that during that time, was that also the first time you heard about CWS, or was that earlier or later?
No, that's exactly the first time I heard about Church World Service. In fact, I remember I was a member of the International Church of Bangkok. And I remember, so they would have a coffee time after the service, and I was just talking to somebody who seemed nice, and his name was Skip Dangers. And I think in the course of that conversation, I was, by the way, Skip, what do you do? And he then went on to tell me he worked for Church World Service, and I said, "What is Church World Service?" And he explained to me both what he did. So he was doing a lot of work in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia at that time. He was the regional director. And so that was the first experience I had with Church World Service. And then I met also a member of the International Church, a guy named Jack Dunford. And Jack was the Church World Service rep for Thailand and Burma at the time, now Myanmar. And I got to hear about what he was doing. So it was super exciting. When I heard about the organization, what it did, I thought it was great.
And at that time, what excited you most when you heard about the work? What was it? What did you attract to CWS?
Well, so for me, on one level, I was a teacher of English at a Thai high school and junior high, and so most of my day was around doing that type of work. So, but my larger interest of coming to Asia, one of them was to really understand kind of the culture, the world, the context in which it revolved around it. And so when I talked to Skip about like, wow, so you actually go into Vietnam, I thought it was closed to people, and he says, no, we're going in there. And then Jack dealt with a lot of the refugee issues. So at that point in the late 80s, Thailand essentially was the refugee camp of Southeast Asia. It had Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian refugees. And while I was there, actually kind of there's a deja vu moment, because right now Aung San Suu Kyi was just deposed by the military junta. Well, in 1988, when I was there,
Mhm.
She won the election for the very first time, and she won it by like a landslide of over 70%. And then the military put her under house arrest for, I think, 15, 20 years. And so we were getting the first refugees from the Burmese side at that time coming over the border. So really, it was a kind of exciting time to be in Southeast Asia. And then when I was talking to these two people, I was really just really intrigued by what they did, and how they responded to some of these different issues. So for Vietnam, it was closed borders. For Cambodia, it was post Pol Pot. For Laos, it was, again, post-war reality. So both on the development, emergency response, and on the refugee and humanitarian side. So it was just I kind of felt like I learned a real lot about the world during those conversations. And it really, and they worked for this organization called Church World Service, and they were doing all this great work in the world. So that's how I was really introduced to them.
So Rick, tell me then, what was your first job with Church World Service?
So I spent after I left Thailand, I went to seminary for 2 years and got a degree in theological studies, and then I taught in Denver inner city for a couple of years. And frankly, I had this itch to go back overseas. Really wanted to go back overseas, and I built kind of a correspondence with Skip and some others at CWS. And I was just writing them one day saying, I'm really interested in coming back overseas. Do you know of any positions available? Not necessarily with their organization, but with anybody. I wanted to go and live in Southeast Asia again. And actually, I heard back from not from Skip, but from a guy named Lonnie Turnipseed. And Lonnie was the Southeast Asia, or sorry, the Southern Asia director for Church World Service at the time. And so Lonnie basically reached out to me and said, we're looking to fill one position in Vietnam. Would you be interested? And so long story short, I said yes. And so my first, literally, I think it was the summer of, or late summer of, it would be 1994. So I got on a plane for Bangkok. And then on my way, kind of stayed in Bangkok for the orientation, and then flew into Vietnam. And that was my first position. And I was met there at the airport by a guy named Perry Smith, and Perry and the CBS driver kind of drove me to the into town, into Hanoi, and then Perry said, I don't want to see you for a couple of months. And I was like shocked. I'm like, he said, you need to learn the language. That's the first thing you need to do, is learn how to speak Vietnamese. And so he literally like banned me from the office, not for a couple, for probably about 3 weeks. And I figured out a way how to get into the office and to work. But anyway, so that was my kind of my first introduction. And then literally we were on the road probably as soon as I can remember being there, in the sense of, CWS had projects all over northern Vietnam. And so we were out visiting projects almost immediately.
In Asia, you also worked in Bangladesh. You were seconded to Christian Commission for Development in Bangladesh. You did it for a couple of years, and then you went to Indonesia. What do you like about the work of CWS?
So it's so interesting. I think that first of all, I like a lot about the work. Almost everything. I like the grassroots nature of it. I like working with the local partners. I liked, at the time when I was there, Church World Service was really on the cutting edge of a lot of different things. So in Vietnam, for example, because of our member churches' anti-war stance, we were one of the first organizations to get registration in Vietnam. And so we were really one of the first organizations working there and supporting the people of Vietnam on a kind of a grassroots basis, and through, of course, at that time, the local governments, because that's the only way you could work there at the time. So I felt like each of my field experiences with CWS. So I had three, as you mentioned. I had 3 years in Vietnam. I had 2 years in Bangladesh and 2 years in Indonesia. I felt like all of them were just truly a rich experience and a learning opportunity. So my first 3 years in Vietnam really was all about how to run small programs, how to work with local partners, how to, I learned how to put budgets together, do everything kind of like a whole set of skills. I wasn't a technical expert, but I was more of a manager of resources and supporter of technical folks. In Bangladesh, I think in some ways Bangladesh was probably the most fruitful experience I had when I was overseas with Church World Service, partly because we were seconded. You and I were both there at the same time, but we were seconded to CCDB, the Christian Commission for Development Bangladesh, a local NGO that was actually founded by CWS back after it split with Pakistan and became Bangladesh. And then it was run by a local Bangladeshi, Susanta Arikari. And Susant was just like a brilliant guy. I mean, just really brilliant. And I like the fact that his team was multi-faith. I mean, Christians were only less than 1% of the population of Bangladesh. But it was this Christian development agency, unabashedly. But the team in it was Hindu, Muslim, and they were doing really good work. And I felt like Bangladesh at the time, I don't know if you think the same thing, but was in a sense its own development incubation lab, right? It was like there was so much going on. The Bangladeshis, through larger institutions like BRAC and Grameen, but also on the smaller scale with us at CCDB, were trying different things, really trying to deal with kind of the long-term systemic causes of poverty and trying to lift people out. I have two really, really interesting memories from that Bangladesh day that stayed with me. I think that the first was how CCDB was already getting out of microcredit at the time. Like microcredit was essentially going to be the silver bullet to development. It was going to be the change maker. And microcredit's great and it's done a lot of good, but it was harder for local organizations or nonprofits to really do microcredit in a way that kind of more financial institutions or institutions that were created just to do that were able to do. So I like that they were always forward thinking and in a sense ahead of the trend. So I have that memory. The second was in some of the small projects that we were supporting, there were elections, there were local elections, and CCB and our projects kind of supported a lot of female candidates. And so I think it was the first time that essentially a huge number of women were elected, for example, to local government and parliament. And I feel like the support that we gave those communities helped empower those women to run for elected office. So I think of that. It was like, wow, that just you could see change happening there. So that was exciting to me about being in Bangladesh. And then I would say when I went to Indonesia, it was just another completely different lesson in development. And when I went to Indonesia, Church World Service had closed its office for about 2 years. And I think, well, I know they regretted it. They didn't think it was time to close. And for some reason, the local country director in Indonesia decided to close it. And so they asked me to reopen it. And then also there was some U.S. government money available through some of the USDA grants that are given to do food security and to do small kind of projects around food security, such as rehabilitating wells, but also irrigation.
That was during the economic crisis in Asia, right? When you reopened, yeah.
That's right. That was like 98, very late 98. And so just kind of dropped in there and just had to do everything from scratch because nothing was there. There was no infrastructure, anything. And luckily we had the local partners was the PGI, the Christian Church of Indonesia, the South Sulawesi, essentially chapter of it. And so I was able to hire a couple of interesting people who were smart and were going to help me. And then it just kind of grew from there. And we had to write the application to U.S. government, which I had never done before, which CWS hadn't really done in years. And so that all kind of came together and we won the bid, and we were off doing a lot of projects again through local partners for the most part. But yeah, so it was an exciting time. It was just like everything was new. Like I had to, there were no systems for anything that I was doing at the organization. So we had to kind of create those systems as we went. We hired some good people, luckily, and so it all worked out. So yeah, it was just everything I did in those first 7 years was just was a lesson, was a classroom, and I made a lot of mistakes along the way, but I felt like we learned a lot, and it kind of set me up for whatever the next thing was.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. And before we would jump to what you did for Church World Service when you were at the so-called headquarters, we did work together for 2 years. I ultimately, I was there for 7 years, close to 7 years. But I would agree with you, those 2 points that you mentioned in terms of microcredit. What I really appreciate about Church World Service, they always did research. So they found out that, in a lot of those villages where CSDB was giving out microcredit, we had enormous repayments rate, right? 90% and up. But the research that we did showed that, our repayment was made by a credit that they would get from BRAC or from another NGO. So, there is no, as we have learned, I think there is no magic bullet or silver bullet for it. You need a scale of activities and microcredit often has been celebrated as this will solve everything, and it doesn't. That doesn't mean that microcredit did not do a great big deal in Bangladesh as well. The other one is I really appreciate that one in terms of you mentioning the empowerment of women, that Bangladesh as a whole has really pushed for that. You see the differences between some of the surrounding countries that did not have that, put women front and center. So Bangladesh did a lot of catching up as a result of that. I definitely, that's what I learned there as well, is empowerment of women is really key in so many aspects of making this world a little bit better.
Yeah. But also, I would say also just again, if we want to just talk about Bangladesh for a second, I really appreciated being fully seconded to a local organization, right? So in a sense, my headquarters was New York, but my boss was Susanta, right? And so and he, just watching them, how do you say, manage a lot of donor partners, watching what they had to go through, how I think they were tested unfairly in so many different ways by their donors, how they were a minority kind of church, being a Christian group in a majority Muslim country, just all the kind of the challenges that brought. Just also the work. Some of these places were some of the poorest places I've ever seen. I think I have memories of just how poor, Bangladesh was, and so just so much respect for them as a local institution, and so I carry that with me. I really, a lot of groups talk about, for example, in the last 10 years, we've either it's called USAID Forward or the New Partners Initiative or things like that. But in fact, Church World Service, this is one of the things I really appreciate about them, is they've been working with these local partners for decades, and they're really good and they're really strong and they know what they're doing. And so, it's almost like I feel like, the rest of the development community is 20 years behind this thinking.
Now I remember, at that time, CSDB also had the round table where, the so-called partners, were around the table and CSDB would share the plans, and then, the different partners would say, okay, this is what we can support. The reality is, as you also maybe recall, is that was a donor meeting very often. And some were better than others.
Yeah.
And to be on the recipient side, right? Because we were working for this Bangladeshi NGO, I really felt awkward. And it often went against what we are saying in the narrative. We are partners, we work together, but we had to explain every single step that we were making. And I'm not against being how do you say that, responsible or accountable. But there I think, because we are talking here about the 90s, yeah, I mean, I think there also progress is made, but at that time it was often a donor meeting and not necessarily a partners meeting. So
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I think there's a fine line between
yeah.
accountability and transparency, which
Hmm.
are super important, and essentially trying to manage or
Yeah.
micromanage their programs. And so I felt like, there were definitely times in that so-called donor or partners meeting that I felt the donors
Yeah.
stepped over that line. And so, um, but CCD, it was able, I think what was great about them is they understood essentially sometimes I would say the
Hmm.
misunderstanding, and they were able to manage all of that with incredible
Yeah.
grace, actually, and also ability to actually get the work
No,
done.
you're so right. I mean, you mentioned Susanta as a kind of a mentor, and definitely he was, because very often, I was much younger than I am now, so I was much more upset than he was. To see him handle all these issues with such grace was
Yeah.
pretty amazing. Yeah, what I also learned, I don't know how you think about it, is he really always created an opportunity for the younger generation to to make mistakes and to learn and to create that space, which was pretty amazing. As a for me at least, as a leader, so I always try to to mimic him, and because it worked for
Mhm.
me. I'm so grateful for the enormous opportunity that he provided to me when I was working there. So yeah. Hey, Rick, so tell us, so after Indonesia, you was then called back, if I remember, to New York. Quite a lot happened, because that's also around the time that Church World Service split from the National Council of Churches. So can you tell a little bit about that? Why did you go back, and what happened?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of reasons and a bunch of factors about why I went back, but I think it was a very kind of interesting time to be back at the headquarters. I also want to say that I've worked with, um, uh, let's see, three. I've worked with three previous CWS executive directors or CEOs, and I met one at another time, but after he had been in that thing. So I met Dick Butler at one point, and Dick had been the CEO or the executive director. That was the title of Church World Service, and I met him essentially later in my career. But I worked for Lonnie Turnipseed. He was Southern Asia director, then became the executive director of Church World Service, kind of as an interim. And so I worked for Lonnie, and then Rodney Page was hired to be the executive director, and Rodney was there for 5 years. So I overlapped with Rodney's entire term, a bit of Lonnie, and then Rodney's, and then of course worked with John McCullough. For the rest of my tenure at CWS. So I actually had the experience of having met and known, essentially four other CEOs of Church
Mm.
World Service. So, at that time, I was in, so it, kind of tragic reasons, actually. Uh, I don't know if you remember Larry Tankersley.
I do, yeah.
Yeah, so Larry was my boss when I was in Southeast. So Lonnie hired me, and then literally became the executive director of Church World Service, and they hired Larry to essentially be the Southern Asia director. So
Hmm.
at the time, Church World Service was run by regional desks, and so Larry actually had um, a terrible situation. He was just about to retire. They did a colonoscopy and found a very large tumor, and essentially he had 6 months to live. So originally they were looking for somebody to fill in his space, and I felt like I could have stayed in Indonesia another couple of years, but I was asked by Rodney and at the time Linda Hartke to come in and take on that responsibility. So I felt pretty obligated to do it. Plus, I'd been overseas now 7 years, and it was a good time. I thought it was just going to be a small break, and then I would head back overseas. Um,
And
so
sorry, Rick,
yeah,
Linda Hartke was the deputy director programs, right, at that time?
yeah,
Or
so that's
yeah,
right. So Rodney Page was the executive director, and Linda was the deputy director of programs.
okay,
And so I was asked to come to Church World Service to take on that responsibility, and frankly, I thought that's what I came to do, and thought I would just do it for a short time, and I would then move back overseas or something like that. Well, I got there and I find out that actually there was a much larger kind of transition afoot. There were two things going on. One was a complete restructuring of the organization, and then the second thing was a change of essentially affiliation from being a program of the National Council to an independent 501c3 organization. And the interesting thing about Church World Service was historically it had been separate, and then kind of in kind of at one point it joined, and then the leadership felt it was time for that change to go back to being independent. So it was a really significant time in the life of the organization, and it really took its toll, I think, on everybody at that time, because just that was a big, people don't realize how controversial that was at this time. I mean, I think Rodney was just under a lot, mostly Rodney and Linda were under just tremendous stress at that time. Um, so I actually went from being the director of the Southern Asia office to a restructured CWS to being the interim director of the Social and Economic Development Program. So they went through essentially moving from a regional approach to the programmatic work to a so-called functional approach to the programmatic work. So yeah, it was a lot of changes, a lot of things going on, and I really appreciate uh, both my colleagues at the time, as well as Rodney and Linda, in the sense that Linda really was just Linda's an incredibly detailed person and really incredibly talented, and she helped get all the pieces brought together, and Rodney was an incredibly I say just a visionary for where this needed to go, and then relentless in pursuing that vision. And so frankly, I don't know if this would have ever happened without the two of them there at that time. I think Church World Service still would be a part of the NCC, frankly, or the split would have happened further on after maybe some difficult times. So yeah, it was a really interesting time to be in New York and to be at Church World Service.
yeah. No, thanks for telling that story. And if I remember it well, so right after the split, then basically Rodney retired, right? And
Yeah,
that's when John McCullough started interim first.
yeah,
If I okay.
yeah.
And what was your position at that time? With
So I was actually, I think I bridged those two leaders
mhm.
through being at a social and economic development program. I can't remember exactly whether that was done under Rodney or that came with John, but I basically
Okay.
took that role on essentially at that moment.
Mhm.
So I probably was working for John as the SED director for probably 15 months.
Mhm.
Maybe I'd been there on 3 months before he came. So that John was truly the one that operationalized that plan.
Mhm.
And so um, yeah, it was a lot of change. And so yeah, so then that's when I started working for John and started working with actually several of our colleagues that are still with the organization today, like Martine Correa,
Mhm.
and yeah.
And
So
and
yeah.
so, did you not also then um, start the technical resource unit, or was that part of
I mean,
of this? Yeah.
no. So that was so I think we went through some changes.
Mhm.
John uh, was looking, I think, for um, he actually was very clear to me that when I was running that position, that I was an interim, and
Mhm.
so he actually competed that position. And so as he did that, I took on some other responsibilities, and
Okay.
so I went on to what's called technical. I probably had three or four different
Mhm.
titles during that period:
Yeah.
strategic planning,
Okay.
technical resources, um, monitoring and evaluation, because we were just in the nascent.
Mhm.
Not that I was an expert in the M&E space, but I was the one representing Church World Service at meetings and trying to move us
Mhm.
in that direction. So there was a lot of different things that I was taking on. Essentially, I felt like I was the Swiss Army knife of the organization, right?
Mhm.
There was a need there, so they asked me that, whenever there was a need and we didn't have a clear person to fill it, I would
Yeah.
step in and support the organization the best I could.
Wow. Um, okay, I would like to take another step, and that's I'm showing you here the book that was written uh, when CWS was celebrating 50 years,
Yeah, yeah.
and it's called Church World Service: 50 Years of Help and Hope. So, if you would be asked to write a book about 75 years of Church World Service, what are some of the keywords that you would use in the title?
Yeah. Oh, goodness gracious. So of course, I'm drawing a blank. Health and hope, I think, are wonderful. I would also make sure the word hunger was in there.
Hmm.
I would make sure the word community was in there. I would make sure the word most vulnerable, because Church World Service works with the most vulnerable communities. Somehow that there's of course too many words to put in the title,
Yeah.
but I also feel really strongly, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but I was really,
Hmm.
when I came back to the States, I felt very connected to the crop network and our local and domestic side of work. And so, any chance I could to support them, I tried. And, I feel like this whole idea of the crop hunger walk is education. So we're educating, we're not just fundraising, but we're educating people in the US about communities overseas. Um, vulnerable, community-based, local partner. Um, I would say innovative. Church World Service, I think, has been innovative over its history. Adaptive. I don't think people realize, if you look at the history of
Hmm.
Church World Service, how adaptive it's been as an organization. So it started out, as we know, as with the grain train. So post
Hmm.
World War II, um, our member churches organized food to be sent to Europe and also to Japan. I saw a video
Hmm.
just recently on the support, and actually the first country director for a consortium of church-based organizations in in Japan post World War II was actually the head of Church World Service, had the Church World Service director name. So it created this incredible amount of goodwill and humanitarian work in the aftermath of World War II. Then as time evolved, it evolved to an organization that did development, not just humanitarian work, but development work. And it shifted from Europe and Japan to essentially the rest of the developing world. Those countries were no longer developing once they were reconstructed. And so I just feel like Church World Service, for example, I don't know if this is well known, but Church World Service was one of the couple of organizations that sat together with the US government and wrote the PL 480 law. So the PL 480 law governs, of course, a lot of the food aid that's given globally, but we were part of that conversation. So wow, to be invited to be at that table to really have an impact, Church World Service had to be able to do that. And so it was innovative in the sense that it reinvented itself from one thing to another. And I think what I see Church World Service continually doing is reinventing itself to meet some of the external environmental challenges.
Yeah. No, thanks for mentioning that. I totally agree with you. When I think about it, um, I think what you often have seen in the history of Church World Service, it has been doing many different things, but was never afraid also to speak out. If the organization thought this is unjust, and so I really appreciate that, and but also in practical ways of what can you do then to change the situation, not only raise a voice, but also come up with but this is how you can change the situation. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
So let me just jump in on that one again. So I really think, for example, my time in Vietnam
Hmm.
is really a good example of that. So
Yeah.
Church World Service was, as part of, I think the other thing is connected to its members. So the
Hmm.
member churches that make up Church World Service was so critical. So for example, a lot of the CWS members, as I mentioned earlier, were part of the anti-war movement. And frankly, that's an example of advocating for a certain thing. And then we were in there working on the other side, helping people both on the development side, but also on the kind of the post-war reconstruction side. So, for me, there was just a lot of a tremendous amount of kind of commitment. So we speak it, we have a voice, we take a stand on an issue, and then we actually do the work to back that up. So yeah, just really important, and for who we are.
Yeah. Um, Piggybacking a little bit on the historical evolution of the organization, I always say that Church World Service started as this U.S. Christian organization that always tried to work ecumenically, and it slowly evolved into being a global organization that's more interfaith or completely interfaith. If you hear me say that, do you agree? And if so, why? And if not, also please
Mm.
explain.
So this is where I think that from my perspective, Church World Service is still both. Right? So it's still connected to its church roots, which are really, really strong and really important to the identity of the organization. But I think it has to evolve in ways to address a changing world. And so the world around us has become more interfaith and less essentially Christian in it. And so the work that we do has to have elements of that. And so I think so. I've seen Church World Service adapt to that, but I still think in a lot of ways it's connected to those Christian roots. Now even those have changed, right? So the member churches of that make up Church World Service are really special in a lot of ways. They are churches that often say all are welcome, and that's not a necessary feature of churches, other churches in the U.S. So being a church that's all are welcome is really to me kind of the evolution on the. It's still connected to those roots, but those roots actually have evolved as well. So yeah, I think it will continue to be, all of that will continue to be in a kind of in some type of an adaptive evolution. Um, and it's exciting because I think Church World Service is able to bring in, I would say, different partners, be in different conversations that are really critical to the overall kind of mission and work that we do, which is essentially helping the most vulnerable in some of the most difficult places in the world, and really being a critical kind of a link between, I would say, the U.S. and the rest of the world.
Okay. Yeah, Rick, and I really, it's really fun to listen to you also, because a lot of the anecdotes and the names of the people you mention, I know very well as well. If you have to name one colleague, a partner, or a supporter of CWS who best embodies of what CWS is about, who will you name and why?
Wow, that's really hard. I mean, the tricky part is one. So I'm going to cheat. I'm going to do more than one. So for me, I would say, on a partner side, it's a group that we already talked about. It was CCDB. It embodied. It's an organization, not the biggest, but having incredible impact. Um, a group of people just completely committed to improving the lives of some of the most poorest and vulnerable people. Um, and so, I would say Susanta Arikari and CCDB for me, if I had to pick one. Um, I think I've had a lot of colleagues over my history with Church World Service. So it's really hard to kind of put one over the other. But I would say, for me, maybe in general, I would say I'm always been impressed by the crop walk and by the community organizing that we do as an organization. Um, and then so that was partner. That was I think there's I could name a lot more, but we'll just stop with those.
Okay. Can you maybe share an anecdote or an experience which best describes your time with CWS, or a memory?
So an anecdote. Yeah. So I would say, so one of the things. Uh, so when Rodney Page was the CEO and he came out to Indonesia, he was coming out to Indonesia um, to visit. It was in the middle of probably I couldn't think of. I've been in a few crises in my life, but the constellation of crises that all happened literally like just the week before he showed up was just crazy. So really the anecdote of the story is this. So we had a tragedy at CWS Indonesia when I was there. One of the staff, he was an older American gentleman named Bob, and he had a major stroke and passed away. And so we had to air ambulance him to Singapore, and he ended up dying a few days later in Singapore. Um, so that was going on, right? We were receiving, because it was a food for work project, we were receiving rice from the US. So literally one of our biggest shipments was coming in that same week. And then Rodney was coming to visit that week. And there was a lot of, at that time, student unrest in Indonesia. So the students had taken over the South Sulawesi airport. They had literally made like a human chain across the airport. And so all of this was happening exactly at the same time, right when Rodney, my boss, right, the head of the agency, was coming to visit. So it was like, okay, so
I'm laughing because I can picture all of this because I've lived there. So yeah.
Oh my, yeah. So I mean, our office, actually, our church office, our church partner's office was firebombed essentially a couple weeks before. So it was just a crazy time in Indonesia. It was also during the period of instability around Suharto's leaving. So it was just just a super kind of crazy moment in the life of the organization and what trying to do. But in the end, it was just amazing. I mean, tragically Bob passed away, but so then I ended up leaving Singapore and flying back to Sulawesi. Rodney and Sandy had already landed. So the students, it was so funny. So I was talking on the phone to the staff there, and I'm like, "What are we going to do?" And so the staff was like, "Yeah, don't worry, they'll be gone tomorrow." And I'm like, "How do you know that?" They're like, "Yeah, don't worry, they'll be gone tomorrow." And there they were gone the next day. So, but then Rodney and Sandy had to fly through. Of course, I don't know if you remember this, but in Jakarta, like the entire city was on lockdown because of these riots. And so Rodney and Sandy tell this funny story where they're on this airplane coming in from Singapore, and it was like basically they were flying extra planes into to Jakarta to take people out. So they were flying essentially empty planes. So Rodney and Sandy were this elderly kind of American couple flying into Jakarta in the middle of this chaos, and they told me like the stewardess was always asking, "Are you sure you want to go there?" And Rodney's calling me going, "Are we sure we want to come here?" I said, "No worries. As soon as you get on the plane for Sulawesi, it'll be fine." And exactly that's what happened. Like they landed, they took the plane back took the plane to Sulawesi. And so we ended up visiting our partners and projects there. I have this great memory of taking Rodney to, I think it was called Jeneponto, which was in the south. It was actually more of a Muslim area of South Sulawesi, and we were doing a project with the local community. And so we show up, and the team had done the advance. So if you, of course, remember Irma and Henry, they had essentially done the advance work on the trip. Of course, they did the advance work a week before, And between the time they did the advanced work and the time we went there, it rained for 5 days. So we literally were going to be on these kind of, we were going to walk through these rice paddies and walk into the community. And so we get there, and so Rodney takes one step into the paddy. He puts his foot all the way down to his knee into the mud, and he pulls his foot out with no sandal on his foot. So now he's barefoot. So then I'm like, okay, Rodney, we have two options. We can turn back or we can move on. And so Rodney says, let's move on. And then he walked we walked about 1.5 miles through paddies, through really rough trails to get there, because we couldn't drive the cars anymore. And his feet were like sore and blistered, and I was just like, okay, I'm fired. I'm just like, I know I'm gonna get back, and this is my last day with Church World Service. But we got to the community. They're all waiting for us. There's like 100 people there. We were having conversations with them, and at one point it was an irrigation canal that we were refurbishing. And so Rodney decides to jump in. He grabs the pick and he starts like helping them, and the community just loved it, like just could not believe it, and loved it. And so anyway, it was a great visit. He got to see the work firsthand. Again, so I think that's just a metaphor for everything that we do in this world, and with the work that we do, is there's no straight line to development. There's just a series of obstacles that we have to overcome in order to get where we need to go. And in the end, I think Rodney, he still tells some of that story. I think when I think back on those times, just how important they were in my development, in the work of Church World Service, and the relationships that we built. It was just really it was a wonderful time.
That's great. Yeah. No, and I mean, you touched upon many elements that are absolutely key for the work of CWS, and one that I would like to raise here is context, of course, right? And adjust and to see what is necessary in a particular situation. And I think, I've seen, like you, many of our projects around the world, including the US, and I think it's the linkage with the grassroots, which it's not that we are the only one who do that, but because of church relationships, that definitely is most of the time is pretty solid. The linkage with the grassroots and what we try to do. So no, thanks for sharing that. That's great.
I mean, he was such a good sport. Rodney was just all of that. Literally, like, frankly, today with our hyper awareness of security, I'm sure if we had the same level of security kind of infrastructure, they would have said, absolutely not, you cannot go, right?
Probably not.
Right. And so when he went, but at that point, it's really, frankly, it's also, I would say, the other piece that's really important for Church World Service, and I think for others, is this notion of trust. Through our local partners and communities, through the churches that we've created these incredible bonds of trust. And then we trust also that the people on the ground to take care of like what needs to be done. So Rodney had to, talk about a person of faith, right? To trust, to literally, I can't imagine being essentially, Rodney was in his early 60s at that time. He and his wife, right? So Sandy came with him. We're getting on a plane, and the plane's absolutely empty. And the people, the people running the plane saying, "Are you crazy? Are you sure you want to go there?" And he's like, "Yes." And so it's like, so I mean, it just, so it was, it just I think what's critical on that for those local relationships and the relationships in general is trust, and building those. And you don't build those just easily. You build them over time and through a lot of intentionality in terms of what we're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. I mean,
Yeah, it feels like a trip
there are
down memory lane.
yeah, no, this is great because we have a lot of stories. Hey, thanks. So we see each
Okay.
other a little bit later.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Maurice.
Okay, bye.
All right, take care. Yep, bye.
Do you see you? Do you see me? Will you be the eyes so that we all can be?
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram. And if you want to know more about Church World Service, please go to cwsglobal.org.